He saw his comrades rise from the ground, and for good reason. A food truck had arrived. Here, in a barbed wire fenced place, they were gathered together more than 1,000 men. They had long been prisoners of war, and it must be credited that almost all the Russians treated them tolerantly. All except the cook. Pouring porridge into their dishes, he deliberately held the ladle so that half of the meager meal fell to the ground, many of the prisoners falling to their knees to pick it up from the ground. But one soldier held on, not picking it up, considering it a humiliation. "If it falls past him, will you pick it up?" asked Franz, his comrade in arms, with whom he had fought for over a year. "No, I'll pick it up." "Do you smell the porridge today?" It did smell divine, if you could say that about food. The cook was the same as before, smiling and aiming his ladle not at the dishes the German prisoners put up, but past them. Hartmut set up his wok. The dexterity of the German afflitter helped to save almost all the food. The cook was even surprised. Only a small part of it fell to the ground, where 5 soldiers were already lying, waiting for such a handout. They ate directly from the ground, quickly working with their jaws. "What do you think they will do to us? They brought us here for a reason," Franz asked, pulling the remains of porridge from the bottom of the tin can with his finger. "They'll shoot us for the public, maybe even on Red Square." "No, I don't believe that." "Gustav says so too, but I don't believe it." "Your Gustav knows a lot. He never left headquarters at the front. He was afraid of everything." Toward evening, all those who were behind the barbed wire were led into Moscow. On its outskirts was a large stadium, where the prisoners and settled down. Tired of the transition, they lay down directly on the bare ground. Hartmut noticed that when they were led, there were few guards. It seemed that it would be easy to escape. No one dared to flee. They all realized that they were safer here than alone in the streets of the Russian city. As darkness fell, Franz, lying behind Hartmut's back, asked, "Do you remember that the Führer promised a parade of our troops in Moscow?" "I remember. Only he did nothing for this parade." "You are mistaken, Sergeant. The Führer did everything for this parade." The gray-haired major, having heard the conversation of his comrades, joined the conversation. "What parade are you talking about?" Hartmut turned to his interlocutor. "Tomorrow you'll see for yourself." Until a heavy sleep did not restrain the eyelids of the German officer, he kept thinking about the words of the major. How could he know anything? The morning began with the command, "Rise!" The gray mass of men, once the great army of the Great Reich, stirred. Looking around, Hartmut saw many soldiers and officers defecating right where they were, no trace of the boasted German pride left. Lined up in long lines at the field kitchens, the German prisoners were whispering, wondering what the Soviets had in store for them. Hartmut remembered the major's words. Turning his head, he didn't find him around. The cook was different. He himself seemed interested in making sure that not a single grain fell to the ground, and the soldiers lying on the ground caused only a chuckle. After breakfast, where the porridge was accompanied by bread and a piece of salted lard, they were built up. Now there were many more of them, probably several thousand. The unstructured column came out of the stadium into the street, with Russians standing on both sides of the wide road. Women and men, children and old men, they looked at the enemy captured by their army. Hartmut felt no remorse. He was a German soldier after all. The column stopped in a large square. More and more prisoners were brought out from the side streets. They were rearranged several times. A young girl in military uniform was giving orders in German. The prisoners obeyed obediently. Somewhere ahead of them there was movement. Hartmut was glad of it, wishing that the end of his journey through the Russian land was soon approaching. Walking second from the right edge of the column, the sergeant tried not to look at the faces of the Russians, but it was almost impossible to do so. His head, his eyes themselves turned in their direction. He saw the tears, saw the hatred in people's eyes, saw the pity for the prisoners. Near the crossroads, the column slowed down a little, and here the German soldier saw something that made him lower his previously proudly raised head. A boy, about 12 years old, standing almost on the road, took a prepared stone out of his pocket. He wanted to throw it at the German prisoners, but he was stopped by an elderly man who said something threatening to the boy. What was that? The same famous Russian character of which Hartmut had heard many times. After all, these people could be understood if they had decided to pelt the Germans with grenades. Something changed in the soul of the German soldier. He suddenly realized what a monstrous evil he had brought to the land of these people. The column went slowly, and for a long time, Hartmut realized that they were not being led somewhere. The whole meaning of what was happening was to lead the captured German soldiers and officers through the streets of Moscow, the very city they were so eager to capture. Again I remembered the Major's words of yesterday, so that's the parade he was talking about. And yes, he was right, the Führer had done everything to make it happen. The march of captured German soldiers through Moscow, or the parade of the defeated under the code name Big Waltz, took place on July 17, 1944. German prisoners marched in columns along the Garden Ring and other streets of the capital. The very idea to hold a POW parade was suggested to the Soviet leadership by German propaganda. Among the captured newsreels were found films, where under the march of Nazi units announcers said that the soldiers of the Reich marched through the streets of many capitals, and soon will pass through Moscow. A big parade was promised in German leaflets, which were dropped on Moscow in the summer of 1941. Holding instead of a parade of the victors a parade of the vanquished, it seemed, could become the most spectacular propaganda move. The procession was scheduled for July 17, 1944, but it took time to gather tens of thousands of prisoners in one place by that date. The first 11 echelons arrived in Moscow on July 1st, and the last one only in the evening before the parade. The prisoners were unloaded at the Moscow-Dvornaya station of the Western Railroad. Most of them were waiting for the parade at the Moscow Hippodrome, where a special concentration camp was organized. In the period of July 12 to 15th, POWs were given hot food once a day. On July 16th, hot food was given 2 times, and on July 17th, a hot breakfast was given before the performance of the columns. On July 17th at 11 a.m., 600 men, which included more than 1,000 officers and 18 generals, were to set off. From the Hippodrome the columns moved along the Leningradska Highway and Gorky Street. On Mayakovsky Square the procession was divided. Some marched to the Kursk Railway Station Square, while others marched along Bolshaya Sadovaya Street and further along Bolshaya Kalazkaya Street. The event was not widely advertised. Only one newspaper and the morning radio informed Muscovites. The Moscow City Police Department informed citizens that on July 17th a column of 600 German prisoners of war of rank and file and officers from among those captured recently by the Red Army troops will be held through Moscow. In this connection on July 17th from 11 a.m., the movement of transport and pedestrians along the routes of the prisoners of war will be restricted. Citizens are obliged to observe the order established by the militia and not to allow any behavior towards the prisoners of war. In the report on the parade of the defeated, compiled for Stalin, it is stated that during the passage of the columns of prisoners of war from the population were numerous enthusiastic cheers and greetings in honor of the Red Army, our Supreme Commander-in-Chief, and in honor of the generals and officers of the Red Army. There was a large number of anti-fascist shouts: "Death to Hitler! Death to fascism! Bastards, that they may die! And why were you not outnumbered at the front?" The streets of the city, the report said, were appropriately cleaned and washed after the prisoner of war columns passed. The watering machines, which followed directly after the columns, were also part of the agitation spectacle. Boris Polvoy wrote, "Right after the last rows of prisoners, there were columns of watering and washing machines, which immediately, on hot tracks, washed and cleaned the Moscow asphalt, destroying, it seems, the very spirit of the recent German procession." Victory parades were not the only type of patriotic education of the general population. In Moscow there was a kind of open-air exhibition, where everyone could look at the trophy German weapons. By the way, the route of one of the columns passed by this exhibition. Newspaper reporters wrote in this connection that the captured enemy met with their own, also captured, equipment. The propaganda effect of these events was so great that a month later a similar event was held in Kiev. Here is how the Kiev parade of the defeated is described in a report addressed to Stalin, Molotov, Malenkov, and Sherbakov. 918 people, including 540 officers, were concentrated for convoying prisoners of war through Kiev. The movement of columns of prisoners of war through the city was carried out according to the plan and route prepared by us and approved by Mr. Khrushchev. The total length of the route through the city from the place of concentration to the place of loading into echelons amounted to 21 kilometers. The columns of prisoners of war passed along the busiest central streets of Kiev. The total length of the column of prisoners of war when moving through the city was 5 kilometers. The columns of prisoners of war passed through the streets of the city for 5 hours. Windows and balconies of houses were filled with local residents. According to the most modest calculations, the number of inhabitants amounted to 170,000 people. The movement through the city was organized and was not accompanied by any excesses. However, when the prisoners of war were passing by the hospitals, there were numerous attempts on the part of soldiers undergoing treatment and disabled soldiers of the patriotic war to penetrate through the convoy chain and strike the prisoners of war.